around Israel and the issues that relate to it that's generally very, very poorly informed historically and biblically. And so what I mean by that is that who was in Israel, which is properly Palestine. Like, I grew up with my encyclopedia set still had Palestine as the name, a pre-48 set of encyclopedias. So when I looked up the Middle East in my, wow, jaw just went ghost there for a second. When I looked up my encyclopedia set on the Middle East, my maps all still said Palestine. And I was like, well, what's that about? Who are these people? What's Palestine? It turns out, there was all kinds of people in 1948 that lived in that area that were Palestinians, and how Israel came to be in that place at that time is a whole saga. But it starts with, you have to start the premise about Israel to be a Zionist. You have to start the premise that those people, those primarily Ashkenazi European Jews, had a right, like, that goes all the way back to Abraham, to despoil whoever lives there for however long, because God gave it to them. Mm-hmm. Immediately, there's a few problems with that. The promises about the land are contingent on faithful obedience. Like the maintenance of the law and the Jews' relationship to God himself were necessary components to that right land. And modern day Israel is very, very far from that. The Ashkenazi Jews don't have the purest claim to being Jews anyhow. After the diaspora, there's Persian Jews in Iran, there's Arab Jews, there's Yemeni Jews, there's Ethiopian Jews. There's Jewish communities all over the place that are not Europeans, which even within Israel for large amounts of time have been persecuted by the Israelis, because they're not the Ashkenazi, pure Jew that they expect to be there, which is ironic in all kinds of ways. And then there's also religious sects that don't accept the notion that a secular nation state has a right to call itself Israel. And this is another spiritual claim that derives itself from the Old Testament promises and curses, that if you aren't faithful to me, then you have no legitimate claim to this place. So all those, like, without even arguing dispensationalism or Zionism, all of those are prerequisites to the modern state of Israel having a religious claim as a theocracy that it doesn't pass to even get us there. Let's define a few terms, because I keep hearing this term dispensationalist and into theology, so I should know a lot about it, but I simply do not. But just the kind of the general idea that God works with different people differently at different times. Maybe that's an oversimplification of dispensationalism. I mean, that kind of makes sense to me. I think maybe the real rub is when they say that, like, the Sermon on the Mount doesn't apply to us, it applies to a future dispensation, or they believe in like a literal 1,000-year reign. Like, where are the problems with it? Maybe I oversimplified like my understanding of it as well. So dispensationalism, and for anybody that's interested, like I said, I just did a citywide meeting at Followers of the Way, specifically on dispensationalism, where we traced the roots of it, where it came from, who its strong advocates were, and what its main points were. So if you're interested in this, check out Followers of the Way's YouTube channel, and you can find a whole message just on dispensationalism. But in short, I think there are features of dispensationalism, but I think to get at the heart of what dispensationalism is that the notion that whatever is written in the Bible, and particularly in the Old Testament, has something to us that it meant to its original author and its original audience. So the idea of Jesus adding, or the church adding, meaning or fulfillment or any kind of new notions to old texts is completely rejected within the notion of dispensationalism. So when they're talking about, when the prophets are writing about the land, it means the same thing today that Jeremiah meant when he wrote his Jewish audience then. You can't use Jesus or the church or the spiritual supernatural version of the kingdom like you've heard, but I say none of the prophetic texts about the geopolitical Israel. So there's
the
Zionists.
opposite of what I was saying then, kind of. Or
yes, right.
Okay.
The reason it's called dispensationalism is because Darby is kind of like the grandfather of dispensation, father of it, depending on how you count it. And he was a Plymouth Brethren guy, and the Plymouth Brethren at the end of the 19th century were doing like these kind of like we think of the Adventist people and the JWs do now. They had this huge thing about prophecy conferences. And Darby kind of got popular in these prophecy conferences, and his notion and his teaching was what he called dispensationalism. And he was looking at God was working with the world. That's where you're getting that notion from. But what the feature of that teaching was that the age of grace was like parenthetical in the plan of God. Like he starts with Abraham, and the Jews reject Messiah. All that history happens, and then the church age starts just to provoke the Jews because they're disobedient. But God's really interested in the Jews, the physical Jews, and he's only using the Gentile church just. And then on the other side of the church age, the Jews are going to come back in revival, and it's all going to be really about Jewishness. Like, so that unalterable plan of God, like he really is after the ethno blood of Abraham, is really still the apple of God's eye. You can imagine all kinds of problems that people would have with that, and certainly the early church would have tremendous problems with that. But so does Paul. Like when in Galatians, when he's differentiating, like he actually calls physical Israel the children of the bondwoman. Like the physical Jews in Paul in Galatians are the children, and we, the Christians, are the children of the free. They're from Sinai, we're from Jerusalem. Like he himself makes these distinctions that are completely incompatible with dispensationalist ideology.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like the opposite of what I see, where I would see it more like the Jews, the whole purpose of God choosing the Jews was so that the blessing could come to all the nations, rather than the nations being kind of for the Jews. Which I mean, Paul does mention that God is using the Gentiles, or was at least, to provoke the Jews to jealousy. So I think that's true, but it's sort of a side note. It's not like the whole point necessarily.
Well, and we can see this in relief in the Old Testament. I mean, Abraham's name is Abgoyashins. It's literally in his name, is to be the father of the nations. Like this global pursuit of the divine plan is in all these things. When Solomon dedicates the temple, this shall be a house of prayer for all nations. Like we see these punctuated major points even in the Old Testament, the lineage of Christ coming from Gentiles. Like there's specific like allusion to the idea of Jesus breaking down the middle wall of partition and globalizing plan.
Yeah. So Anthony and I were talking a little bit earlier, and he mentioned that, well, he was also talking about how, the promises about Israel having the land are very conditional. And I think you had some scriptures on that, Anthony, or some more thoughts on that. You want to jump in here? Is your internet good enough?
Maybe not.
We can't hear you, Anthony. He's not muted. The blessing of Abraham certainly not on his internet tonight.
Maybe he's not being faithful.
Maybe he's not blessing Israel. That's why he's not blessed with good internet. He will curse those who curse Israel, Jah. There you go. We can't hear you. I don't know if you're talking. Anyways. Maybe you
Yeah, I
should
got
call
nothing.
in with your phone. Anyway, we'll let him. We'll give him some time to repent. You were gonna say something, Matthew.
Well, the question I think that's more relevant than just logical discourse is what the implications of this are. So they either think Palestine was an inhabitantless wasteland when the Jews showed up, or it was full of the same people that I'm afraid of and think that are causing all the problems in the world. And so it's good that Israel's there to keep all the bad people in check. That's how a lot of the narrative runs about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And if I want to be charitable, I would say that, you know, and 80s, maybe even the late 60s, the activities of the PLO as a terrorist organization under Yasser Arafat were doing some very provocative things in the world about, you know, kidnapping airliners and a lot of the situations that were going on were being used by the PLO to good effect, to terroristic effect, to make people afraid. And that what I try to do when I can the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I want to try to be able to understand both sides. Like, I don't think that Palestinians are just like not really humans and they don't love their mothers and they don't love their children and they're just terrorist dogs that want to destroy the world. I presume that when people are reacting in ways like that, that there's reasons for the whole Middle East and its conflicts, like as a region, are not happening in a vacuum. They're happening as responses to colonialism, to oppression, to despotism, to religious conflicts, to a whole host of things, and poverty on top of it. And they don't, if you care about those things, then it's worth trying to figure out where they're coming from. So when I talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I want to humanize the Palestinians for people, because I don't think that's Americans' impulse. I think that they know that there's a Palestinian church. I don't think that they consider what it's like to live in Gaza or to live in Bethlehem or to be under the Palestinian Authority, or they don't, we want soundbite solutions for complicated geopolitics, and it just isn't sufficient. So you have to start digging in and trying to figure out, well, where are they coming from? What's their grievance? Why are they reacting this way? If you want to have something meaningful to say about the issue. Now, very, very few people do. They just want to pro-America their way through the Israeli conflict situation, but it hasn't worked. Like, it hasn't worked. Like, since 48, the Middle East has been embroiled with conflict over this exact difficulty. And unless you want to just kill all the Palestinians, which it's not a very marketable slogan, then we have to figure out what's going on there with these people and why they feel the way they do. And it's not hard to understand once you start to look at what's happened to the Palestinian people throughout Israel's history, how they've been treated, the oppression. I mean, according to UN laws, the occupation is internationally illegal. The death rates between when there's intifada, that means a conflict from Palestine towards Israel. When there's an intifada, the death rates are so there's so much disparity between. So in the last conflict, I can't pull the numbers right off my head, but it's over 200 Palestinians were killed, and I think 12 or 13 Israelis died. But when you talk about dispossession and homelessness and how many refugees were made, it's in the tens of thousands. So tens of thousands of people dispossessed from their already very difficult lives. Hundreds of people killed, whole families, doctors, schools, UN installations, hospitals being bombed. Here's what I just want to plead with people when we talk about this issue. if you, by the misfortune of birth, had been born in Gaza, what do you think your life would be like? If you had the misfortune of being born a Palestinian, how would you look at these things? And until somebody can at least grapple with that question, I don't think that they really have much meaningful to share on the issue. And that doesn't mean that all of the actions of Hamas or the PLO before them are right, are just, are not terrorism. It just means, what is it like to be a Palestinian? And if it seems consummately Christian to start an analysis of this particular question and conflict with that premise. What is it like to be a Palestinian? When you see those little girls screaming from their houses being bombed, or the family being, when you see fathers holding their dead children and wailing, what is that like? Like, that generally isn't happening on the Israeli side of the border, and it's a very common occurrence on the Palestinian side of the border. What is that like? What does that do to people who go through those experiences? If I wasn't a Christian, and I was a Palestinian, and I was holding my dead baby, you can bet that I would invest the rest of my life in the destruction of Israel. If Israeli bombers blew up my house and killed my family, it would become my only purpose for living to try to fight the oppressors and stop this bloodshed. That's why we have the Palestinian conflict and Hamas the way we do.
Yeah. Maybe we could kind of track how, and I think you kind of touched on this a little bit, but like, what was, you mentioned that like there wasn't just a barren wasteland of terrorists when the Jews moved back to that area. What was the civilization there like? Because I know there's Palestinian Christians. In fact, like, didn't the Christians first name Israel Palestine? Like the first Christians? I think I read that in a Tom Holland book recently. But anyways, I know there's Palestinian Christians, and like historically, what was like the whole reason for moving the Jews back there and being like, oh, here we now own this land?
Right. Well, so Palestine was under Ottoman rule for a long time before colonial rule, and that switch from Ottoman to colonial isn't a big piece of my interest. I'm more interested in the modern conflict, but under the Ottoman rule, Jerusalem, and there's a little museum in David's Citadel right inside the old city where they talk about the history of and how many times it's been called, all the things. And even there, which is a very, very Jewish site, they display that during the Ottoman reign, Christians and Muslims lived in relative peace in Jerusalem. When I was there, I spent a couple weeks in Jerusalem, and I set aside one day to do the Stations of the Cross, to just walk through the Stations of the Cross. And I was doing that. I was just going from site to site along the Via Dolorosa and outside the city. And I was taking time at each of those sites to just reflect. And I was walking between them, and a merchant kind of grabbed me, and he wanted to sell me his wares and whatever. And I stopped and talked to him for a little bit. And I'm interested. I'm not looking for stuff to buy. Are you a pilgrim? And I said, well, not exactly, but kind of. And he said, yeah, I'll leave you. And he started talking to me about Israel, and he asked me a funny question. He said, the Jew, who is the Jew? And I was like, well, what kind of question is that? He said, the Jew I know, he's been in Jerusalem for thousands of years. He said, who is the Christian? He said, the Christian I know, he's been in Jerusalem for 2,000 years. And who is the Muslim? The Muslim I know, he's been in Jerusalem for 1,500 years. But who is the Israeli? The Israeli, I don't know. here for 50 years. And that's a conceptualization that really I find striking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I don't think that there has to be conflict between Jews and Christians and Muslims, Arabs there, because there have been long times of history that it hasn't been conflict oriented. So what is it about Israel that's creating the conflict? Well, it has something to do with colonialism. It has something to do with foreign interests within that place. And if you look at the history of Zionism, which is a Christian concern originally, it's Western Christians that really start to, like in particular in Europe, when Christian Zionism starts to make inroads, it's Ashkenazi Jews. They feel like they're being, like it's an attempt to run them out. Like, get out of our country, go back where you came from, is how some of the sentiments that you read from the Ashkenazis when Christian Zionism starts to become a buzzword. There is a lot of European hostility against the Jews. Like, we always think, especially as it pertains to the Second World War, that it's the Germans who hate the Jews, but that's not accurate. All the Europeans hate the Jews. The French hate the Jews. The British hate the Jews. The Americans hate the Jews. Like in 1942, I think it was, there were of Jews looking for refugee status when we knew they were being persecuted in Germany, and America turned their ship away and in fact passed law. It was both Italians and Jews were forbidden from immigration to the U.S. in the early 1940s. So the idea that the Germans are unique in their distrust and for the Jewish population is a misnomer. It's a European thing. I think that in watching the horrors that happened in Germany, the rest of the West kind of backed themselves up and slowed their roll and said, we're not going to go down that way. It's too much. But Jewish hatred is not a hard to find in early 20th century Europe. So Christian dispensationalist movement is really the big pushers of this Zionist campaign in the early days, but that takes deep root, especially in the British Empire. Early documents is the Balfour Declaration. I don't know if I'm being a bore here, if I'm going way too in depth. Let me know. But the Balfour Declaration is one of the first. Declaration is one of the first legal documents that advocates for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Balfour was a British legislature, I think. It was the name of what do they call them? They're senators.
Parliament.
From the House of Lords. And anyhow, Parliament. Yeah, and he was an MP. Anyhow, so makes its way up into legislative quarters in England. And the advocation of a homeland for the Jews in Palestine becomes, because what happens is that the English took Palestine from the French, and they didn't really want it. They wanted somebody to settle it so that with everything going on with the wars, they weren't really looking to have more to do. When Israel is settled in the late 1980s, India becomes independent. So between the Second War and the independence of all kinds of trouble raging for the British Empire, not to mention all the trouble back at home from the end of the war in rebuilding, London and all the bombing in Europe. So England isn't really looking for a long-term another problem on their hands by settling the Jews there. But if the Jews would do it themselves and would take the responsibility and would hold the place up, then you have British influence in the Middle East and not have to own the trouble. And that's kind of the negotiation between the religious Zionists and the political in the British Empire. But Palestine is full of Palestinians. the Arabs call the settlement of Palestine al-Nakba.
It's
I forget how it's translated. It's like the great horror or something like that, the terrible night or something like that. And it's placement of
by the Jews.
And so here's another feature that I don't think most people really understand about the Israeli-Palestine conflict is that there are religious fundamentalist Jews who are following the Zionist principle that they own Israel. Who lives there, they own it. And the issue of this, the attempt to negotiate some kind of peace between the Palestinians and the Jews has been to set up a Palestinian Authority, a place like it's a situation similar to what India was doing with Pakistan. We're trying to make a separate place. Like Pakistan was supposed to be the place for the Muslims, India was supposed to be the place for the Hindus. And so they've done that with Israel on a much smaller scale, that the Palestinian Authority is supposed to be the place for the Palestinian Arabs and Israel for the Jews. But the Jews, the fundamentalist Jews, and politically and religiously, but mostly religious, aren't satisfied with that. They want all of Israel because they're there because of Jehovah's promises to Israel, to the Jews. And so they're by hook and by crook facing and putting Palestinians wherever they can. And so what they do in the Palestinian Authority, within the small territory that's left for the Palestinians, they're buying up what can clandestinely, moving small groups and setting up like gated communities within Palestinian territories and running their own policing, their own security, their own connections, and they're just pushing the wall further and further into Palestine. Palestinians who are already under an internationally illegal occupation, who already have a history of oppression from the Israeli state, are now being pushed out of the little bit of area that they have. And they know that the people that are settling those places, by and large, think that they have no right to be there. Now, it's ironic that the allegations from Israel are always that the Palestinians, and particularly the PLO and Hamas, say that Israel has no right to exist. But Israel continues to, in not too subtle ways, continue to support Israeli Jews doing exactly that, saying to the Palestinians, you have no right here, this is mine. And so two-state solution is what's always talked about in this regard of everybody to be there in such a small amount of land. But the conflicts are always happening over these settlements. It's not even about al-Nakba. It's not even about the Israeli oppression. It's always flaring up over these illegal settlements of Jews. And what happened in some occasions is that a group of Jews will just go start setting up shacks. Israel, the state, is legally obligated not to allow those things to happen. But what's documented time and time again is that even though legally they're not, they do support the settlers. And Netanyahu has said, my government will be as friendly to the settlers as any Israeli government has ever been. And now the new prime minister actually comes from a Palestinian settlement. He grew up in a settlement. So there's every reason to expect that this is going to get worse, even though his government is supposed to be kind of a coalition Palestinian Jew with some Palestinian Israelis. Arab Israelis. Anyhow, the settlement conflict is where the point of the spear is in many of these conflicts. One of the places where that happened most recently, for those that don't know, was in East Jerusalem. Jerusalem is split into quarters. The old has a Muslim quarter on the bottom side, and the Christian quarter, and the Armenian quarter, and the Jewish quarter. Those are the four quarters of the old city. And in East Jerusalem was like, Jerusalem used to be like Berlin. It was split east and west. Originally, Jordan had East Jerusalem, but it was always the Palestinian side. The Palestinians lived in East Jerusalem. Well, the Jews have been buying up whenever they and property within East Jerusalem, and using some very old laws to enact like archaic eviction laws that favor only the Jews and don't allow the Palestinians to use the same laws to get their territory back, and so dispossess Palestinians, and it happened during Eid, and then because of those evictions out of East Jerusalem of Palestinian families during Eid, there was tension already, and the IDF showed up at Al-Aqsa at the mosque during Eid, and then there was anti-Palestinian marches that were radical fundamentalist Jews, all the around the Temple Mount, and then just chaos broke out, riots broke out, and then rockets broke out. That's the root of the conflict. So I always hear from people over here that these base are just wanting to lob rockets indiscriminately into Israel for no reason, and there's no thought for why these things should be. It's such an unsophisticated analysis. I at least, even if you disagree with me, we have to at least look at the causes if we're going to have a meaningful conversation.
Yeah. First of all, Anthony, you want to try to talk again? His window is saying unable to subscribe to stream in a reasonable amount of time. Anyway, now I left.
He just dropped out again.
So I wonder if we could pivot this to talk about why this matters to Christians who do not run for political office, because obviously this has become a really partisan issue in the United States, with the left siding with Palestine and the right siding with Israel. And so it just has become a polarized issue that people like to argue about. But and we're not gonna I mean, you at several points you've been saying, hey, it's somewhat reasonable for Palestine to respond violently or whatever. And I know you don't mean that in like a supportive way, because obviously we don't support violence in any way, but we're not gonna, lobby for laws that free Palestine or whatever. So maybe the real issue here is that this sort of oppression would not actually be happening if it was not for people who claim to be Christians supporting the oppressor. And is that the issue? I mean, even like with our people, like if you think about like conservative Anabaptists, for example, yeah, like the ones who are politically involved might in theory be supportive of Israel, but like, are they really empowering the oppressor? I mean, obviously evangelicals are empowering them through voting in, right-wing politicians who empower Israel. But like, what's the real catch here? Why does this matter? Obviously we should care about anytime people are being blown up and families are being destroyed. Like, we need to care. Is there something we can do besides, going over there and trying to provide humanitarian help? Or are we just trying to like raise the standard against the wickedness of Christians supporting this, or kind of what's the goal here?
Yeah, I think it's a justice issue. I think when we read the prophets, and when we're provoked again and again by God Himself and by His spokespeople, it seems very much to me like God is trying to cultivate within us a capacity to care for people who are oppressed and defiled, like this sense of justice. When I look at the Middle East, when I look at pictures of the Iraqi occupation, when I watch Iraqi homes being invaded, and then I flip over and I see Palestinian homes being invaded, and maybe it's because I'm darker skinned than most Anabaptist people, but every time I see a little girl in those pictures, and that's what I think God's trying to do through the prophets. I think not just the prophets, but through Jesus Himself. I think in humanizing the whole human race, we're supposed to see even in our enemies, we're supposed to see ourselves and our brother and our father and our sons. Like, the humanization of everyone is the goal, and that's what the Christian ethos is supposed to be contributing to the world health, like to the health of society. And so that ought to condition our responses to any kind of conflict, because we're supposed to be the peacemakers. We're at least supposed to care about peacemaking, even if we can't be directly involved in it. And if you're going to care about peacemaking, then you have to know which side's being oppressed. And if you're going to know which side is being oppressed, then you have to care about those who are being oppressed. So these justice concerns are the initial premise. And then if you care about it and you start to look into, well, why is this situation thus? Why are people being oppressed? Where is it coming from? And what's the motive behind it? Why is it happening? What you find is that American support, and by and large, I think that support has been stoked and propagated and legitimized by and large by the Christian community.
That's horrendous. So then you start with this concern for justice.
You start for caring about why people are being oppressed, and then when you get to the bottom of the sum, you see that it's predominantly the American Christians who are responsible for the oppression. And they don't. I don't think that. I mean, they think they're fighting the good fight against the bad people, and it's not anything the way it's being presented. So American evangelicalism has set up a system, just like European evangelicalism did it with the original Zionist movement. Now the American Zionist movement, the American Evangelical Zionist movement, is responsible for all these weapons, for all this money, for all of this political will to continue to oppress the Palestinian people for the sake of really Western influence in the Middle East, disguised as Judeo-Christian affinity, tribalism, neo-Christian, like the East versus West, the Muslim East against. I mean, it's really like medieval. It's the Muslim East against the Christian West, and Israel is the Mason-Dixon. It's the line where they cross.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I want to circle around back to that, because I actually taught on the topic of justice this last Sunday in Richmond. But we have a question before we get to that. We have a question from JLP, who's watching in spite of the fact that we only have 50% of most dank icon here.
Half the icon's gone.
And if you want to join us, JLP, or anyone else watching, I dropped the link in the live stream where you can actually call in. I think that link should work if you click it and then hit start live call in or something. But anyways, his question is, I have an end time question to do with Zionism. I used to be Zionist, but then my theology of the two kingdoms pulled me out of that. However, my end times view of historic premillennialism has not changed, which it should. He should become an amillennial partial preterist. But anyway, this is probably for you, since you're.
He probably loves the early church too much.
So he says and doesn't love reading scripture in context, So if there will eventually be a mass conversion by the Jews, Romans 11, at the time of Jesus's return, how do we separate that from Zionism? Do you believe in a mass conversion of the Jews?
I think that so as a premillennialist, I believe in a revival in the end days. But the question for me is that may or may not have nothing to do with physical Israel. Since the diaspora, we don't know where Jews are. Well, like we don't even know which communities are Jewish. And there's certainly no reason to think that whatever revival there should be only come from the Ashkenazis. It could be from any quarter of physical Israel. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that it's very likely that whatever, if that's the case, if we assume premillennialism, then the most likely scenario is that physical Israel, the Jews there, are going to be the ones who get in the way of those evangelists that are springing up out of physical Israel. Like that will be the detractors. That will be the people trying to shut them up and silence them. Whatever Christian witness would arise from physical Israel will become the enemy of the secular nation state of Israel. And I think I always say those terms together because there's been such a religious sanctification of the nation state of Israel that I always say what it actually is: the secular nation state of Israel. It is not Judaism. It is the secular nation state of Israel. And it's very purposely secular. It's very purposely a nation state. That's why the more radical forms of orthodoxy don't accept the validity of the Israeli state because it's not predicated on the law, the Mosaic law. So, and Ben Gurion and the original founders of Israel knew that. They were trying to purposely create a secular nation state of Israel. Yeah. So there's no reason to read Israel as the benefactor of that evangelistic fervor that's predicted in the premillennialist outcome.
So circling back to this issue of justice, when I was studying to talk about it on Sunday, I think I kind of can see a difference between how the Old Testament prophets related to nation states and even how John the Baptist related to them with how Jesus and the apostles did. So John the Baptist, we see confronting Herod and saying, hey, it's messed up that you have your brother's wife. The Old Testament prophets were constantly railing against nations for being unjust. But we don't really see that from Jesus and the apostles. We see more of a kind of a more subtle approach. And so I do think it's important. I don't think it's wrong. I think it's sometimes necessary for Christians to call out what evil nations are doing. But I think primarily, like when it comes to justice, primarily we are creating an alternative society where justice actually does prevail. So maybe what that would look like is just planting a church in Jerusalem where Palestinians and Israelis can celebrate the Eucharist together, and also caring for the poor, caring for those who are suffering physically. Is that the case, or like do you kind of disagree with my analysis there?
Well, I generally I'm sympathetic to your analysis. I don't know that I agree. Tell that fox Herod is a pretty scathing rebuke. I think Jesus invests most of his energy in upsetting systems and orders within Israel itself, and the broader Roman world isn't his primary concern. So even there in John, we find him going to violence as his instruction to them and show fruit meet unto repentance. He's not really going after Rome either, although I'm sure people wished he would have, just like Jesus. But what I don't know how to separate myself from is that my people, American Christians, are directly responsible for the oppression that's happening. And so it's not like, for me, it's not like if Switzerland was funding the occupation of Palestine, like I would probably still have similar things to say if asked about it, but it would matter very little. Like I don't have much to do with whether or not Switzerland funds the occupation of the Palestinians. It just would be immaterial. Like it could be just as bad, but it would be immaterial. Is what's it got to do with me, especially if it was coming from a secular state, not from a Christo state. And so when you mix evangelicalism into the political spectrum here, that so much power and influence, then these things that could be just state issues all of a sudden become religious issues and I feel personally, fall back in my domain. So when we're asking questions about justice, are the Palestinians being unjustly treated? It's also, are American Christians responsible for the unjust treatment of Palestinians?
Yeah. So your main goal here is to get American Christians to stop supporting Israel, like to really simplify it.
Right.
All right, you all heard it. Stop supporting Israel.
The secular nation state of Israel.
Correct.
Which, in your Pollyannic vision of just making a church in Jerusalem, the Israeli state would not allow you because it's illegal to proselytize according to Israeli law.
Wow.
You're not allowed to make Jewish converts there.
Aren't a lot of the leaders actually atheists as well?
Yes.
Yeah,
It used,
Anthony was.
Women serve in the IDF. The state-funded abortions, the Israeli Defense Fund, the state-funded abortions for female soldiers in the IDF. I don't know if that's the case anymore, but it used to be.
Yeah.
How's that ruffle evangelical feathers?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think like what could convince someone who's just a diehard Zionist. What would get
the only
them?
thing that convinces people is to humanize the people that they don't care about. Like, that's why I continue to talk about Palestine. I'm not a fanatic about Palestinians. I'm a fanatic about people who are being oppressed and killed and destroyed. And if we can get people who are Zionists to stop and think about the humanity of people who are living under that situation, at least maybe we can get them to slow down and think about things in a little more complicated way. That's my goal. That's why I always post pictures. Like, I've gotten one ding I've got zucked once in the last year, and it was for posting pictures of people grieving dead Palestinians. And I'll take that hit. Like, I want people, if people are going to support Zionism, then they need to look at it in the face. They need to see grieving fathers. They need to, and the answer is always, well, it's because of Hamas. Well, Hamas didn't kill their children, and if we're going to run death tolls, and you have thousands of deaths in the last 5-10 years, this is the interesting thing is that this issue politically in America does cross the evangelical line. It's not just a conservative issue. Like, it really is an American empire issue. Obama was responsible for supporting Israel under the last intifada in 2014, and it was way more bloody than this last short one. That's the one where those little boys were playing soccer on the beach and were bombed by the IDF. Like, it's just, it doesn't have, this is a politically complicated situation. I don't want to minimize that. It's not like there's easy answers, but from a moral perspective, it is easy to always say whoever's killing children is wrong. Whatever the conflict is about, if dead babies are coming out, you're the bad guy. No matter what, if you're America, if you're Hamas, if you're Brazil, if you're Israel, when your bombs are killing women, innocent civilians, women and children, you're the bad guy all the time, every time. That's always the Christian perspective. Whoever kills the babies is bad. Like, that could just be our anti-Zionist mantra. Whoever kills the babies is bad. It's not morally complicated. Like, I don't care how when you have to kill children, you're the bad guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noted. I saw someone post something on Facebook about, and this was a very popular conservative Anabaptist leader about, there's these. What did he say? Rockets being fired at this terrorist bunker, and as always, there's some civilian casualties, and that was basically the offhanded comment. It's so interesting how you can just frame it like that and minimize that. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Anyways, on that happy note, do we want to wrap this, or do you have anything else you want to talk about?
Yeah, it takes a lot to get me tired of hearing myself talk, but I think with just the Titus and Matthew show, that's probably enough of a lecture on anti-Zionism.
Yeah, because I don't disagree with you, and I don't know a lot about it, so it's basically me interviewing you.
I've worked myself into a corner in all of my public endeavors. People want to hear me disagreeing with people. It's one of the most common feedback on my other podcast, Talking the Chasm, is people get bored when me and Felix agree on stuff. They want to hear us disagree.
Well, we could probably find something to disagree about.
Well, we'll have to on the next episode.
Okay, sounds good.
When will our next episode be?
That will be, I guess, in a month, last Friday of next month.
Right.
Are we going to talk about women's roles?
I would like to.
Oh, boy. That's the one issue that has split the dank kingdom in half. Like, I don't think there's any other issue that has caused more drama.
Yeah, I may be teaching on that in the next month. So,
don't you teach on that pretty much every Sunday?
No, far from it.
But you have taught on it. You taught about the God is a patriarchy was literally a title. So what else do you have to say?
Men, women, and the patriarchy. No, I want to talk about, and the next time I talk about this issue at Followers of the Way, I don't want to talk about what isn't a woman's role in the church. I want to talk about what is a woman's role in the church.
Which is having babies.
It's part of it.
See, I think I disagree with you on this, but honestly, like within the dank kingdom community, it's mostly about rhetoric. I feel like because very few of these folks, with some exceptions, would like affirm like a woman being a pastor of a church and teaching on Sunday,
right?
And yet, like, depending on how you phrase certain things, and if Drew's listening, he'll be like, no, it's not just about how you phrase it. We've gone around and around on this, but like, I honestly think a lot of it is just the words you use. And like, are you like trying to constantly be shining a light on all of the ways that the women, you know, are elevated and have authority or whatever, or are you doing the opposite? It feels like a matter of emphasis. Do you agree with that?
I think that's a large part of it. I think there are some substantial differences, but they're not as substantial as they are outside of our niche. Like the in-house debate is different than the out-of-house debate.
Here we're getting into this topic, but I assume that you actually submit to your wife on certain issues that she's more wise than you on, right? Like, I know you're not into calling it mutual submission, whatever, but like, I'm sure that there's been a point in time where Erica has said something and you've said something else, and then you're like, you know what? She probably knows better than me on this issue, right?
No, I do that. If not every day, at least every week.
So that's mutual submission. Like what?
Well, so here's where you're right, that it's a matter of how you define terms, which every issue is always about how you define terms. When the Bible talks about submission, I think it's a conflict resolution mechanism. It's a way of sorting out when you're at an impasse. That's the reason for it.
Do you reach impasses with your wife regularly? Because I feel like if that's like a regular event, you have marriage problems.
Right. No, but I think a large part of why we don't reach impasses is because we have clearly defined roles and where submission comes. That's why I don't call listening to my wife submitting to her. I don't think it's mutual submission. I don't think it's the same thing. I think submission is about, so like my wife had this is all commercial for our next episode, I guess. But my wife had this epiphany one time. She said, some of these, she said it occurred to her that I don't submit to Matthew very much because it's so very rare that we disagree. But when we have a disagreement, that's when it becomes an issue. Like when we don't see eye to eye, How do we resolve that? And that's where submission comes into play. And that's true in any system that uses authority or submission. Now, when we look at the Godhead, we wonder, well, why should Christ submit to the Son? Because the Godhead isn't in conflict. But what is it about? It's the way that the Godhead resolves, like, who's planning
This is ministry.
Who's sending, who's commissioning, who's ordering, who's directing. It's the one that comes first. It's the Father, the one that everything comes from. And the reason Paul uses ordered terminology in 1 Corinthians as his rationale for the head covering is because woman comes from man, and man comes from God, and Jesus comes from the Father.
Okay. What do you do with submit to one another right before wives submit to your husband?
We should save it for the episode.
Okay, sounds good. Let's do that.
That's enough of a teaser. Maybe people will get on board.
Can we get Rebecca Mooey on that episode?
I don't know if it would be profitable.
Her and Drew and a few others, they're on a tear, man. I feel caught in the middle.
Yeah, but you know what's right. You just your head is torn between you're torn between your head and your heart. You're torn between the scriptures and your affections.
I think that there's a New Testament emphasis on the elevation of women that's coming into a context where women are oppressed. That like that's if the New Testament is doing anything about gender, it's doing that. And not elevating in the sense of you have babies, which is so amazing. Sure, it's amazing that too, but like that's not what I mean when I say the New Testament elevates women. I think it does it in other pretty specific ways where it breaks down gender stereotypes. And I just think it's important to emphasize that as well. Like they were the first ones who discovered the tomb. Like Jesus had women disciples, which other rabbis did not have. Like they're women co-workers with Paul. The husband doesn't have authority over his body, but the woman does. Like all this stuff would have been scandalous. And if like all we do is try to fight feminism, that doesn't.
Are you sure all that stuff would have been scandalous?
Yeah, like I mean, do you not think so? Like the Roman Empire was like more patriarchal than you, which is pretty impressive.
There were some awfully powerful women in the Roman state.
Okay, but like
the Roman society.
The idea that a male biographer of Jesus's life would have the disciples cowering and like a female followers of Jesus discover the empty tomb, be the first proclaimers of the gospel. If by proclaimer of the gospel you mean testifying to the resurrection, that's unusual. Like that should grab your attention.
Yeah, I don't want to whitewash the bad things about the Roman Empire. I just think that it's a more complicated. There are chattel systems regarding women in the old world, sure, but there are also. It seems like the more complicated a social order is, the more that line is not a straight one.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, there's always been exceptions for sure.
Well, and I think the more complicated a social order is, the more exceptions there are.
And you think that's bad? The exceptions are bad.
What
about the biblical exceptions like Deborah? Are those bad?
Well, I mean, the question to exception, like, what's the point to the exception?
I don't know. You could say there's a moral trajectory where God is breaking into their cultural expectations with like a little progress here and there.
Well, if you want to know, I mean, there's an answer to the question. Deborah tells us. I mean, she says, fine, if you're too much of a sissy, then a woman will lead you.
Well, there you go. I mean, that's a human's perception of it, I guess.
What she says. She was there.
Oh my! What about driving a stake through a dude's temple? That's always on the table.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. There was that woman that threw, what was his name? Shimey's head over the wall.
Yeah, all good stuff.
All right. Well, next time we'll talk about women's issues.
All right, sounds good. Three dudes talking about women.
Just like the Bible.
That sounded weird. Yeah, that's always your comeback, isn't it? All right, I'll catch you later, man.
All right, bye.